Hello and welcome to today's online workshop uh, sponsored by Save the Kids Institute for Critical Animal Studies, Transformative Justice Journal, and the Peace Studies Journal. My name is Nathan Christopher Poirier, and I am here on behalf of ICAST, the Institute for Critical Animal Studies. And we are here with Anthony Nocella from Salt Lake Community College and Arash Daneshzadeh from the University of San Francisco. And today we will be discussing a critical pedagogical perspective on facilitating not teaching in higher education. So Dr. Nocella will speak first for several minutes, and then Dr. Daneshzadeh will speak for, sorry?
I'm graduating in 1 month, so yes, soon.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that.
No, you're good.
But then he will speak for several minutes as well, and then we'll have some time for some question and discussion after that. So, Dr. Nocella, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. In approximately about 2008, 2009, I started working on a book around academic repression, and that idea was with Peter McLaren and Steve Best. And the idea of that was that we're not talking, we've moved into a field of schooling away from education that would perpetuate academic repression and eliminate, dismantle, and destroy this concept of academic freedom, right? And which Paulo Freire, John Dewey, Bell Hooks, etc., have all discussed this idea of academic freedom. And I think it's a farce. This idea does not exist when economics is part of education. It cannot exist, right? True education must be separated and detached from all forms of economics and value base, right? And one value base is grading, right? So we need to take out this idea. And I would also challenge the notion of any form of standardization of education, because education is rooted in a form of liberation and individualist understanding and reflection, right? Critical reflection. So to standardize how I learn versus how Nathan or Arash learns is completely simplistic, generalizing, and oppressive, right? And so we need to figure out that we are in a state of massive academic repression, and what we need to figure out is how we can resist it while being hypocrites within the field of higher education, specifically what we know as the corporate education system or the academic industrial complex, or a hybrid of both, right? And I'll touch base on this hybrid notion, right? There's these three elements of how higher ed is fostered, right? And so I think once we kind of move away from this lecture teaching at kind of analysis, and we start facilitating, what we do is we eliminate the goal and we foster the process. All we are is guides, and we're sharing knowledge, right? This is a kind of an anarchist, pedagogical, Ivan Illich kind of framework of sharing knowledge, right? And once we begin to share knowledge from a location of one's experience, which is feminist pedagogy, we begin to talk about stories and narratives rather than intellectual, detached, objectivist, modernist perspectives, right? And I think that's the very white colonial settler state perspective, right? And it's very much about win-lose, competitive, capitalistic frameworks, right? So I think part of this other part of the pedagogy that Arash and I kind of really challenge with this colonial education is hip-hop pedagogy, that you can do something with nothing, right? That means that it is anti-capitalistic, that you can learn without having brick and mortar, YouTube, Zoom, et cetera, et cetera. Hip hop has proven repetitively that we do not need finances or economics to learn, right? Where higher ed is arguing the complete opposite, that you need money to learn, right? And if you want to learn, you have to go into debt for that, right? So I think that's kind of a very important aspect within, probably Arash will talk about, on how hip hop pedagogy is a resistance pedagogy against this, corporate education or academic industrial complex. And then I'll just talk a little bit about the three, and then I'll stop and, I'll let, Arash kind of expand on his work and his ideas and his scholarship. And so corporate education, you typically see that with research and the R1 institutions. So you would see it at a Stanford, you would see it at a private institution, Harvard's, where they have direct relationships with government, DHS, DOD, DOJ, or Lockheed Martin, et cetera, or banks, Bank of America, where they are training or allowing the school to train the students into future work and labor cogs, right, for these companies, right? So these companies aid in creating the curriculum, the pedagogy, the practices, and the courses, so that these students are prepared to work in these specific companies, right? And so that saves a lot of corporate training, and it creates more efficiency and effectiveness, right? So there's a pipeline, right, into that, and that's corporate education. Henry Giroux, Peter McLaren have kind of spoke about that. David Harvey talking about that from a neoliberal perspective. Naomi Klein talks about that in Disaster Capitalism. So then what we have also is academic industrial complex, right? The academic industrial complex is a lot larger and it's a lot more complicated. So what we could see as an academic industrial complex, a great example would be the UC school system, right? The University of California school system. It's such a large behemoth of a beast that what they're doing is producing for the sake of producing, right? That they don't have a goal or an objective or a partner in mind, that they're just producing, even though that they possibly are producing more PhDs than are needed within the workforce globally in higher ed. They're keep on producing, right? And they don't have like a really specific goal in mind. So their goal is to produce diplomas, right? So they want as many people graduating in 4 years, and then 1 year for masters, and then being as efficient and as effective. It's Taylorism factory model, kind of what Marx kind of critiques, right? And so what we do is we have a hybrid as well, right? And a great example of a hybrid would be, let's think of a public school that does research, Berkeley, right? Berkeley is producing on the undergrad level, right? And just pushing out students, doesn't even matter. While at the grad level, they are trying to get their professors, their grad students, et cetera, to lock in corporate and government contracts, so they build and produce products, right? And so that's kind of a hybrid between the two, right? And we see that most often in the public research institutions. University of Utah, with their big medical investments, their whole school is pretty much medical, right? As well as, you see UCLA maybe as this huge, large institution of pushing the medical industrial complex, right? So, we need to understand the apparatus that we're articulating, and because if we don't, then we can't really navigate in a conscious and deliberate manner. So that's the beginning, and I wanted to kind of talk about where this conversations begin, right? So we have to go away from that and then let go of everything if we want to start facilitating, right, from a critical pedagogical perspective, right? So critical pedagogy is looking at powers and systems and institutions, which I was talking about, but then also letting go of the goal, which these institutions have specific goals in mind. We have to give up on the idea that maybe even a community college, Salt Lake Community College has approximately 10 to 15 students that actually graduate with a diploma. Majority of the students are there just to learn 1 or 2 classes. Maybe they're in the summer and they say, you know, I would like to learn a little bit more about, you know, auto mechanics. I want to learn about culinary, you know, and how to make a cake, and how to cook a little bit better and how to be a chef, right? But their end goal is not to get a degree, but their end goal is to just learn, which is like an amazing thing, right? But we get caught up in this idea of, no, we are a successful institution if we provide degrees and if all the students are getting degrees, and maybe getting away from that whole notion, right? So that's kind of where we need to kind of move on. I think, you know, Arash's work and ideas are really kind of moving us forward as he kind of finishes his PhD right now.
So thank you. I also want to thank you both for joining me on this conversation, but Anthony, just for moving the proverbial needle forward and having a conversation at a time where I think neoliberalism, or as Giroux and others have called it, either late stage capitalism or Taylorism, moves us towards this, what constitutes as a scalable form of pedagogy, where the underpinning is ultimately something that I think Dr. Nocella alluded to several times in his presentation, which is turning schools into these quasi-degree granting factories without thinking about what you know, people like Claude Steele and others have said, which is the purpose of education, which is to prepare a criticality amongst our citizenry. And so what does that actually mean? So there's an element of subversion that should be involved. And just a little bit of background, if I can take a few steps back. My work looks at sort of the inextricable link between capitalism and many of these deficit-based interventions like restorative justice that have become very faddish in education, as a mode of what I would call emotional or behavior regulation among students that are seen as high risk and predominantly tend to be low income, special needs, learning disabled, or students of color, and as well as students who are formerly involved with the juvenile justice system. And so a lot of my work is tethered to the school to prison pipeline, but I'm really looking at distinguishing between what Dr. Nocella and I call transformative justice and what has seen as incarnations of restorative justice that have elements of transformative justice or potential for transformation to them, although they've been implemented in very capitalistic, scalable ways. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because so much of the public discourse around RJ, or restorative justice, is grounded by many of the same proponents that are pushing this scalable model of social distance learning education. I strongly object to this presumed sentiment that popular education interventions have little to no merit because of their meteoric rise in classrooms without proper vetting. So this idea that something is popular so it's automatically bad is absolutely not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that in the same way that we want to make sure that our citizens are better equipped to evolve as our society becomes more globalized, more technologically sophisticated. We want to make sure that our classrooms are the same, but there's also an element of criticality. What that means, as McLaren, Nocella, Stovall, and others have said, is that we question power. We think about power dynamics, and we think about how to flatten those proverbial hierarchies and how education balkanizes our society. So many archaic and racist and settler colonial practices that were longtime staples in school systems, such as tracking and busing, would still be unencumbered in vanguard policies in the field of education now if it were not for the introduction of more transformational and relatively untested practices. For example, Tier 1 restorative justice. So restorative justice programs that incorporate community voices in a circle. Small learning communities. So classrooms that are actually co-taught by different breadths and subject matter. So when you have an AP chemistry teacher working with an ethnic studies teacher in a classroom, not only can they learn about gentrification, but they can learn about the link between what's happening in Flint, Michigan, and gentrification, or what happened post-Katrina when a lot of charter schools moved in and displaced and dispossessed a lot of Black and brown communities from public education. So having these conversations that are not only interdisciplinary, but are also by proxy questioning power dynamics is what really constitutes the status quo that I think Dr. Nocella and others are really pushing for, is creating an education that's scalable and criticality, which means that you must also localize them to the communities that they purport to serve. Another thing, one of the most existential contradictions in education is we perpetuate the same things that we purport to subvert, meaning we want to create a citizenry that's prepared for a globalized and technologically sophisticated society. Well, how do we do that when students can't adapt and they're reading from basically our carbon copied pedagogical tablet that has been reproduced across communities without any sort of nuance or texture for the students that it's purporting to serve, meaning it doesn't account for socioeconomic differences. It doesn't account for power paradigms. It doesn't account for students that have had severe trauma that has been intergenerationally reproduced and recycled through their communities as a result of the military or police industrial complex. So having these types of conversations are crucial before we start thinking about how to scale curriculum in of itself. Another example would be culturally responsive pedagogy. Both small learning communities and culturally responsive pedagogy have endured multiple iterations over the years, one of which is what now has been seen as a burgeoning breadth of theory and practice known as hip-hop pedagogy. And so a lot of my work looks at the link between what I've introduced a new theory in my dissertation called the restorative cipher. So I actually, before the Corona shutdown in San Francisco, did an ethnographic study at an alternative school that serves predominantly Black and brown youth who have been involved, who are justice involved. So they're opportunity youth. A lot of them don't work. A lot of them are formerly incarcerated. A lot of them come to school with ankle bracelets and monitors, and they got parole officers and so forth. And the school is trying something new. They're trying to actually ground hip-hop pedagogy where they have community circles in their homeroom where students actually introduce every semester a new topic that's vanguard, that's germane to public discourse, that's ubiquitously talked about. In this case, might be the coronavirus. Last year, it was what was happening in the water, the toxic water supply in Flint, Michigan. And then through an interdisciplinary mode of small learning communities, the students are actually learning to present and pitch their own social entrepreneurship ideas for projects that can not only transform the dialectic in a classroom, but their communities writ large. So an example would be, there's a lot of, Elaine Brown is a former Black Panther, actually works with San Quentin Penitentiary, which is a prison system that I teach in for the last 7 years in Richmond, California. And a lot of some of my formerly incarcerated students there who work with urban gardens throughout San Francisco actually run urban gardens throughout the city, and they teach youth to actually garden. And at this alternative school, they actually have an urban gardening program that works with formerly incarcerated adults with the supervision of former Black Panthers. This program is now taught through a community model where there's non-credential folks teaching the class, but the students during the day learn how to test the pH through their AP Chem classes, learn about how Silicon Valley companies that are gentrifying San Francisco are having a direct impact on the cleanliness of the soil supply in those urban gardens. And students actually, through a self-directed learning quest, have measured the topsoil and presented lead runoff that they've actually found to the mayor. And within 2 weeks of doing this, they got free and clean orchard supplies of soil delivered to their school. And this was the impetus behind this was what was happening in Flint through an RJ circle that a critically conscious teacher just sort of dropped this seed and helped the students sort of build off of that to the point where the project-based learning around the urban gardens took on a life of its own that was facilitated by the teacher, as Dr. Nocella was referring to, but really spearheaded by the students themselves, and has a more than restorative approach, because they're not only trying to think about how to restore the harm that was done with the lead runoff because of the displacement that's been happening and so forth, but how to actually transform the community at large. So the students are now going around and doing presentations at local nonprofits, educating their elders, and they actually took that in an ethnic studies lesson that they learned, where they actually read a book about the SNCC programs in the 60s in Mississippi, and how voting drives were being run by Howard and other HBCU grads who were coming back to the South in the summers and teaching Black communities in the South about their voting rights. And so the students took that element and they're adding it to this urban gardening project. So there's different elements from history and power dynamics that students are taking, and they're making sure that these same intergenerational traumas that are systemically perpetuated do not constitute the reality moving forward. This would not happen if we had a scalable education that was simply being reproduced for this as the status quo. So thank you again for allowing me to share sort of an anecdotal example. And there are many other examples of archaic and racist practices that I'm sure all three of us could wax rhapsodically about, but I just wanted to share that because I also wanted to provide a little bit of hope that there are schools that get it. It's how do we take that model of the school that I've been studying for my doctoral work and reproducing that sort of consciousness, that zeitgeist across the country.
For sure.
All right. So thank you very much, Dr. Nocella and Arash, for that. So now I have a good couple questions that came up during the course of what you had to say for each of you. And so I think I'd like to go back to Dr. Nocella first. And these questions came up in the context of who I asked them to. It came up in the context of your individual talk here, but it doesn't mean it has to be answered by only one of you, of course. So Dr. Nocella, so you were talking in the beginning there about critical pedagogy being against the standardization of teaching, and so in every sort of respect. So grades do that. Perhaps even just assignments to a whole class does something like that, or delivery method does that. And so I was thinking about then kind of the student's role in determining their own sort of education, perhaps their own path, and so I guess I was kind of wondering about. So I think it's rather obvious there wouldn't be much of a hierarchy between student and instructor in true critical pedagogy. But I guess I'm wondering about students trying to learn a lot sort of on their own and really sort of struggling. And I guess kind of how does then the instructor come back in to help a student without creating a hierarchy?
So I think first we need to do away with degrees. And if we really look at what critical pedagogy is discussing, right, we need to do away with degrees, away with certificates, badges, and this idea of grades. And we have to do away with the idea of academic schedules, right? So we begin to have relationships in our community where we sit down with people when we can, and then advance our knowledge. But it means that everybody in the room, wherever we meet, around a tree, in a building, on a parking lot, after we go run, after we go roll, whatever it is, we all have to be consciously, deliberately engaged and in a very active, aggressively reflective manner, right? And I think right now we've created docile bodies that are the best example of a student. So the more docile you are, the better the student you are, right? If you ask too many questions, you actually could get kicked out of class. If you're too participatory, you get kicked out of class. If you're too experiential about your dialogue, then you get kicked out and you are noted as not being theoretically engaged enough, right? So I think we need to do away with that, right? And then go into not even creating a syllabus. I say to many people, I say, oh, we have to create a syllabus with the students. It's like, I don't create a syllabus with you all. Like when we're hanging out and socializing, I'm not like, hey, can we have a syllabus of where this dialogue is going? And make sure, Nathan, that you read this and this before we have a conversation. How elitist and perpetuation of colonial settler discourse is that, right? Like, no, you come with what you got, I come in with what I got, and then we come in whatever emotional, behavioral, physical, and mental state we are at, and then we engage, and we engage with asking questions without any judgment, right? Or I wouldn't say judgment, but without any prejudice or discrimination, right? Judgment, I would say, is not a bad term. It's just judgment, in my opinion, is knowledge plus experience equals judgment, right? But I would say like prejudice or discrimination, right? That perpetuates the elitism of knowledge, right? That I have more knowledge than somebody else, right? Like, hell to the no, right? Like there's no way. And then I think that's the dilemma that we've constructed within the ivory tower of academia, right? And I think we talk about this liberation and this like beauty of relationships within higher ed, and what we're perpetuating is this oppression between relationships, right? And I think once we can say at the very beginning, like of the class, everybody gets an A no matter if you come or not, then we can just get away with that. So everybody gets an A. If you don't come at all, doesn't matter. You paid for it. Cool. It's like, hey, I paid for a TV at Best Buy, but I have to wait 6 months and I have to do all these things, right? And I have to be in good behavior to get that TV that I paid for. You know, nobody would do that for a TV in Best Buy. You pay, like, you throw your money down, you get a TV, and you peace out. This is the only relationship where you pay for something where you may not receive the good that you've purchased, right? And the quality of that purchase. So I think first we need to do all these things, but in the short term is challenge ideas of outcome and standardization, create a facilitation and dialectic. Finally, I would say allow your space not to be between you and the students, but throw the questions on the board, throw them on the table, have conversations. Always ask that why? Like, why do you think that way? Why is it this way? Like, why do we watch this movie? What do you think about this, right? Like, rather than having the answer, never give an answer if you are facilitating. A facilitator of a course should never give an answer, right? But allow the students to discover the ideas by themselves, right? And then you are a guidesman, right? You are a Yoda, one might say, right? So, so that's where I would kind of end the conversation today.
Okay, yeah. That sounds good. Yeah, you mentioned in the beginning of that answer, doing away with degrees, and that was something else I had down as kind of a question. So that would really help in that respect. So then maybe to go back and forth a little bit. So to ask Arash a question.
Sure.
Towards the beginning of what you were saying, you talked about restorative justice and transformative justice, and a little bit about you kind of mentioned there was a bit of a difference, and so I guess can you kind of speak a little bit more to what that difference is, and then
Sure.
also kind of what is the role of transformative justice, I believe, is the side you're landing on, correct? And so are we would critical pedagogy be teaching transformative justice, or would it be an act of transformative justice, or how does that fit in?
Thank you. I appreciate that. And these are great questions, and no not patronizing you at all. These are great questions. I appreciate these. They're actually forcing me to think even beyond the realm of this conversation. So thank you, Nathan, for just sort of planting that seed for me. I appreciate you. And I also appreciate what you said as well, Dr. Nocella. So the first part of your question. So I would say that one of the constructs of transformative justice is interrogation of power, and then the second is making sure that you're flattening hierarchies, which I know both Dr. Nocella and I both talked about. And we could talk about it ad nauseum, but I think just for the sake of brevity, I'll start with an example. So one thing that I know, Nathan, both you and Anthony touched on is this idea of rubrics. And what does the idea, the construct of a rubric look like in this sort of like evolved world where transformative justice at least is something that we aspire for in our new education system. So in an RJ model that is what I would call deficit-based is sort of this idea of like post-coloniality. So we're like inclusive of making sure that we're hiring more Black superintendents, Black principals, Indigenous, First Nation teachers, making sure that we have the tokenist sort of Indigenous or Black and Brown voices in the textbook. However, emotional and behavioral regulation is still the name of the game, making sure that we are still adhering to a power paradigm that has not shifted in the last 1,400 years of settler colonialism. And that is the difference between post-coloniality, where we're just regurgitating coloniality in a sort of more newfangled way, and decoloniality, where that's what I'm going to touch on in a moment with regards to transformative justice. Now, and sort of distilling that down to a rubric, it would be where as a professor, I give my curriculum and instruction students in the School of Ed at USF final paper every year, and I actually give them a blank rubric, and I have to grade them as the professor of record. I have to give them a grade, which is something I do begrudgingly. Anthony and I talk about this all the time. Grading is our least favorite practice, but I put A, B, C, D, F, incomplete, and I write non-negotiables, like the things that no matter what I need and the school requires of me to need of my students in order for certain deliverables to be met for an A grade. So that would be like APA format, making sure there's a reference page, there's a type, the basic stuff. But beyond that, how they present, how they argue, that is something that I want the students to be able to, as the central stakeholder, as the fabric of the classroom dialectic, it is paramount that they're on board, that we're not talking about inclusion that's conflated with post-coloniality, right? That's inclusion in terms of decoloniality. Inclusive voices that move the transformation of what teaching and learning actually means. And so students, after a little bit of, grappling with me, because they're not used to this level of like latitude in the classroom, they're asking, well, what do you mean? What do you mean what do I think constitutes an A grade? And the students will actually get into debates, and it's a really rich conversation about what a student who's earning a master's or an EDD at USF, which is, I also teach at the EDD level, what should those students look like? What is criticality actually? Now, paradoxically, to that form of transformative justice modality of inculcating a rubric in a master's level classroom, there are many classist, settler, colonial, Anglo-normative interventions like grit, Angela Lee Duckworth's work, and growth mindset, Carol Dweck's work, who's one of my advisors at Stanford, who I used to argue with all the time, that superimpose this deficit-based pathology upon low-income children of color, particularly Black youth. Now, it's funny that two middle-class white passing women would dare to superimpose what constitutes the status quo of learning for low income, special needs, Black and brown kids, right? And ultimately reduce systemic inequities upon the lack of emotional and behavioral regulation of those kids and their families by extension. It's funny that they would put the onus of systemic inequalities upon kids not fighting hard enough, i.e. grit, or kids not being aspiring enough, i.e. growth mindset. When I have white colleagues right now in academia, and I know Anthony does too, who could barely hear the word white privilege without having a conniption. And you want to tell these kids that they don't have emotional regulation? That's not only farcical, it's ironic and laughable. So to me, these types of theories smack of the type of privilege, eugenic sorting that's germane to the white supremacist roots of U.S. education that Freire talks about. And he also talks about in Pedagogy of the Press about this idea of false generosity, right? We want students to graduate with degrees so they can survive in this capitalistic, plutocratic society. However, why not then also have a duality to that? We want them to survive, but also be able to, what did we talk about at the onset of this conversation, is that existential contradiction of education. We're not arming them to subvert. We're just arming them to reproduce. So where is that? So despite this relatively new status of grit and growth mindset within the educational canon, it's still reproducing that same coloniality, right? And so I do agree that RJ, as the data in my research and many other of my contemporaries who study restorative justice and transformational justice, that as the data of many qualitative studies find, is that restorative justice has the potential to uplift aspects of student voices, but it will not do so if there isn't an element of interrogating power dynamics. Otherwise, restorative justice is tantamount to two kids get in a fight in the hallway, and they learn how to behave themselves through a very Eurocentric, Anglo-normative decorum before they come back in the classroom. Now, who gets to determine that? A counselor, right? And you think about 80% of staff in public educational institutions look a lot like Carol Dweck, look a lot like upper middle class white women, teaching Black and brown kids like me, first generation refugees like me, how they should behave themselves without thinking about systemic trauma, without thinking about power dynamics between pupil and instructor, without having these very, what Vajra Watson, who's one of my academic North Stars at University of California, Davis, in the School of Education, she talks about this idea of radical vulnerability, where teachers actually earn a lot more legitimacy with students when they actually start off at the onset of every semester talking about their own privilege, talking about their privilege, debunking elements of this Horatio Alger idea that education actually dismantles power dynamics rather than fortifies them. And when you do that, students are not only bought in, but they're bought in to the point where they want the tools to dismantle. So that's where they see classrooms being useful for them. And they actually feel more engaged, and then we go into involvement theory, and a lot of those old theories that Aston and others talk about. So, but you can't get to that point unless you get that buy-in. You can't get that buy-in without talking about the elephant in the room. You can't get in the elephant in the room unless the teacher themselves, the instructors, are willing to be transparent about power dynamics that exist between them and their students, let alone the ones that exist on an exosystemic and macrosystemic level between the school and society at large. And so we talked about what that would look like in the example of a rubric, but in a classroom, you can't talk about project-based learning when the projects are not germane to what the students are going through, which is why in that example of the school that I mentioned, I gave them a pseudonym in my study. So I'm in my study, they're called Harmony High School, which is a name that I made up to protect the students that go to that high school, since many of them are involved with the justice system. But at this school called Harmony High School, transformative justice changes every year, and it's at the sometimes impetuous whims of the students. What do they think is transformative justice? Which means what is the most recent version of white supremacy and capitalism and the violence that's sanctioned by a white supremacist and capitalistic society? What violence have they endured recently? And they talk about violence, and from violence they talk about power, and from power they talk about solutions. But you can't be solutions oriented. You can't have grit and growth mindset when the entire onus for 1,400 years of settler colonialism is put on the emotional regulation of a child. That, to me, the fact that we have bought into this for so many years, myself and my colleagues, to me is a referendum on our education as educators, and really our underlying purpose in going to this field. For me, I didn't want a doctoral degree unless it could allow me to have opportunities to transform systems rather than simply rubber stamp and say, oh, look, this university finally hired a brown guy, a cis hetero, brown guy, but at least he's brown. Now you can put me in all your brochures so you can recruit other brown students like me. And that's absolutely not my goal. Anthony knows me well enough to know I am not BSing this. So I would not have gone into this field had it not been for an opportunity to not only interrogate power, but dismantle them and to really speak out on behalf of students, and as much as possible, do ethnographic studies that include those voices that are being invisibilized. Not giving voices to students, which is another faddish way of saying students are at a deficit, they don't know how to speak for themselves. But actually amplify the voices that have been left unheard and inert and silenced for so many years in our public system.
Yeah, wow. All right. Yeah, thank you for that response. This is such a great topic because education at its core really should open people's minds, and regular education can be fascinating in a way, but I think the critical pedagogy perspective that you two are talking about is just exponentially more sort of mind-blowing and mind-expanding. So there's always a lot to digest for me with this topic, but it's really great. I love hearing what you all have to say. So I think kind of in the spirit of a little bit more of a critical approach. So instead of kind of going back and forth with questions, right, and separating things out, just kind of put questions to both of you and let either or both of you kind of respond. And so I guess one thing I was wondering about is somewhat of a practical aspect of trying to teach in a critical manner, and that is still having to deal with actual grades. So if you still have to end up giving a grade on a 4-point scale or whatever at the end of the semester, I guess how does that work if you're trying to teach in a critical manner? Do the grades, do teachers, would you recommend you still assigning grades like normally would, or do they kind of take on less value for an instructor? Is there more leeway in kind of the traditional grading scales, or I guess can either you speak to something like that?
Yeah, I could. Is it okay, Dr. Nocella, if I answer this first? I would say that I wouldn't use the word leeway because I think there's a connotation that we're like making concessions to our students, whereas I think our students are brilliant. Asa Hilliard, who's one of my favorite educators, talks about in order to love your students, you have to believe that they're brilliant no matter what. And it's one of my favorite quotes in education. Mm-hmm. And there's this idea, this Bourdieuian idea of like cultural poverty, where we make concessions to students and we fall in love with a student and we want them to go to school at our alma mater. And so we want to like socially, promote them. That's not what's happening in what Dr. Nocella and I do. What's happening is those grades represent something significantly different than what they are in a quotidian sense usually represent, which is the scalable model of pedagogy. What they represent to me is aspects of the non-negotiables that my students believe constitutes an A grade, a B grade, a C grade, a D grade. So not only do those, not only is it not leeway, but it's actually more emphasis on what students believe, and there's a core level of inclusion behind those grades rather than me unilaterally as an ambassador and really as a plant of the university peddling this idea that every A student has to look the same. And that's not the case. Criticality doesn't look the same. And if we felt that way, we would have given up on Detroit Red before he became Malcolm X. So I think that it's really important to think about the cascading effects that the reliability and widely accepted and frankly outdated practice of grades actually has when we think that grades have to unilaterally come from teachers themselves. Teachers as facilitators give the grade, but it is in partnership with the non-negotiables that students determine in order to apply what an A or B or C grade looks like. And so I shared an example of what that looks like for my essay, so I won't belabor that conversation, but I just want to really take a step back and say, before we can talk about grades, we really have to think about grades in service of whom. And in my case, through a transformative model, grades are in service of the students that I purport to serve. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll let Dr. Nocella take it.
As we, kind of wrap up, I would say we first have to address that we're all a bunch of hypocrites. And like I always say that we are hypocrites. And what does that really mean? That we're perpetuating oppression and violence on other people. So when we say that, we are not perpetuating violence, we are. I would say in many aspects, teachers are a lot more violent than police. And so if we really want to look at at the scene of a crime that has the most amount of suicides in the United States, that scene is going to be a school or a university or a college. That location of violence that is perpetuated onto domestic violence, specifically sexual assault and sexual misconduct, is going to not be at a club downtown in New York City, which it does occur there, but we have so much sexual violence by cis men towards women, right? And I think that needs to be addressed. One out of 3, 1 out of 4 women before they graduate in a 4-year location, college or university, they will be sexually assaulted, right? So, hey, let's address this. This idea of suicide, right? Of sexual assault, of alcohol abuse, of overdose, et cetera, right? So we have tremendous amounts of violence going on. So I think there's very little difference between the prison and the penal justice system and the school system. And many people have said this. George Jackson said it. Michel Foucault has said it. The list goes on of people have said this. But I think the difference is the school is looking at the end result, while the penal system is looking at the process. The process meaning they want to punish. They want to examine the punishments, right? The beginning of Discipline and Punishment by Foucault. It was all about the shaming and the abuse, right? It wasn't the end result. It was the public fear factor, right? Where it was the fear that they fostered in the penal system, where in the school system, it was all about the control. Control is the result of fear, right? So the school system is very much about the end result, right? Where the penal system is about the process, right? And I think we need to look at how both of them in a very violent and dangerous manner perpetuate each other, right? For their own means to exist, right? And I think once we see this very violent relationship and we abolish not only prisons, but we abolish schools through a transformative justice lens, then we can kind of move forward, right? Away from this idea of being a hypocritical educator and student, right? The student is as much part of the system of perpetuating as the professor, right? We are all part of this hypocritical experiment of violence where we all have agency, right? I don't want to say because you're 18 you don't have no agency and you're ignorant. No, you do. I think like Green Day, Pink Floyd, Run DMC, NWA, the list goes on. They've all said it in numerous amounts of ways, is F school, right? Like they've said F the police, but they've also said F school too, right? And I think like that needs to be articulated, that Pink Floyd said something so brilliant maybe 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and it still applies to this day, right? Like that, without any PhDs, their story, their narrative of being punks, musicians, like says and resonates, right? I don't know with that, Arash, Nathan, I don't know if you have anything,
The last thing I'd just say, like in some, like we have to start construing this, going back to something, Dr. Nocella said, is like this shaming model of education that produces identities and subjectivities and really objectifies students as this way of life that's driven by this edict of survival of the fittest as the only operable form of citizenship and an educational ideology. There is an opportunity to transform that ideology. And there's this irrational belief in this capitalistic market to solve all of our problems. The market cannot be free if the ideology that grounds that market is grounded in only one ideology, which is survival of the fittest. You can't have that when there's so much universal inequity that is by design. And if we can't have a frank conversation, then who are we actually serving? And schools themselves become an accomplice. And so if we're going to create an opportunity for free thinking, then we need to think about what a free society looks like and distinguish it from the one deliberately, distinguish it from the one that we currently live in. So thank you guys. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yes, thank both. I'd like to thank both of you, Dr. Nocella and Arash, for your insights here. I thought it was very interesting and very inspiring. So thank you very much, and look forward to more workshops like this in the future.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, Nathan. Appreciate you.
Yes.
Thank you. See you guys later.